Back, I'm David Gura this hour to tell the truth about what really went on inside the White House.
Of the United States, the President of the United States use not only the N-word, but other horrible things.
To tell the truth in front of Robert Mueller, a Trump deposition, and his lawyer's fear of a perjury trap.
I'm very much involved in the details. I wasn't too much involved in it.
And to tell the truth, the White House being very cagey about how the first family's parents got their citizenship. Could it have been a result of this?
We have to end chain migration. We have to end chain migration.
We begin this hour with none other than Omarosa and the allegations she has lodged against President Trump. With me now to discuss, Zerlina Maxwell. She's an MSNBC political analyst and the director of progressive programming for SiriusXM. Bret Stephens is an MSNBC political contributor as well, an op-ed columnist for the New York Times. Brittany Packnett is a Black Lives Matter activist and the co-founder of Campaign Zero. Great to have all of you with me here in New York, and I want to dig into those claims by Omarosa in her new memoir. The former White House aide and apprentice contestant, writing that President Trump is, quote, racist, and he has used the N-word more than once. She writes, "They all told me that President Trump hadn't just dropped a single N-word bomb. He said it multiple times throughout the show's taping during off-camera outtakes, particularly during the first season of The Apprentice. I would look like the biggest imbecile alive for supporting a man who used that word." Well, the president hasn't commented on the book, but his administration dismissed it out of hand, saying in a statement, "This book is riddled with lies and false accusations." Well, I want to dig in there first, if I could. Zerlina, I'm going to start with you. Here we are talking about Omarosa. We can debate how sad or glad we are to be talking about Omarosa on this Saturday morning. How does this change the picture that we have of President Trump? She's talking about the existence of these tapes, hearing that word, getting audio of it. How would that change your understanding of this president's approach to race?
Couple of things. First, all it does is confirm what we already know. I think that, what she's doing is essentially confirming his private conduct matches his public conduct. And so to say that the president is racist in private simply just confirms what we have seen him doing for many, many, many years, going back to when he wouldn't rent to black people and the Central Park Five and birtherism, and the list goes on.
So I think,
right. So it's not a surprise that he matches that public behavior. What I also would add, though, is that she's known him the longest of many of these advisors. And so I think that while she has credibility issues on other things, I think in terms of knowing Donald Trump, she knows Donald Trump.
Bret Stephens, on the reliability of this narrator, she describes anecdotes in which she walks in on the president there with Michael Cohen, and the president swallowing a piece of paper. She's wondering what he's doing there. What do you make of what you have read about this book yet? I assume you haven't cracked open the cover yet.
I have not read the book. I do not intend to read the book. Look, there are very, very serious things to say about the way in which the administration has dealt with race relations. We're on the year's anniversary of Charlottesville. But I have to say, unless she has rock-solid evidence of the allegations that she's making, what she's doing is providing the president and his supporters a gift, because her credibility is so damaged that it makes it easy for all of the usual suspects to say, sure, Donald Trump's a racist, just listen to Omarosa. You can see how that storyline builds. And we know too many cases in which one false accuser succeeds in destroying a whole host of highly legitimate points and cases worth making on any number of issues. So this, unfortunately, I would even say, even us talking about it and giving it the airtime we do,
it's good for Simon & Schuster.
Is providing well, no, is providing her with a platform I don't think she's done very much to earn.
Brittany, I want to ask you, Bret brings up the fact we were at this anniversary, a lot of attention on Charlottesville this weekend. Look back, if you would, on the last year, and we've been talking about a very visceral signifier, what she's alleging the president used when he was on The Apprentice, perhaps other times as well. Help us understand how you have processed what this president has said about the way he's alluded to race over the course of the last year since that. I'm just going to point out here again, here we are on this anniversary, an opportunity for a president of the United States to address what happened last year, to try to set things right, to try to bridge this nation together. There is nothing on the president's agenda for today or tomorrow that would indicate that he plans to talk about this or address it in any way.
Yeah, you know, Maya Angelou said, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. I have always believed who Donald Trump is. What Omarosa supposedly reveals in this book that I will also not be reading doesn't change my opinion of that whatsoever. And in particular, when it relates to his response to Charlottesville, he was clear that he thought that there were good people on both sides, people who might have had different ideas than some of us, but that these are two sides of the same coin. We simply cannot afford the kind of false equivalency that says that people who are fighting for justice and freedom are of a different side of the same coin as to people who are white supremacists. And it is unfortunate not only that he is engaged in this behavior, but people like Omarosa and other people of color give him cover to behave that way. When they engage with him, when they say, I knew that he said the N-word, but I went and worked for him anyway, that then allows them to create that false equivalency. That then allows them to accept the premise of this idea that my freedom is just as important as your white supremacy, and we simply cannot abide that.
Zerlina, President Obama was the first to say that his presidency was not a curative for this issue. Yet he addressed it. He talked about it.
Right.
How precipitous has the fall been when you look at leadership, not to have somebody in the highest office in this country working at trying to make this issue better in the United States?
So it's not only that Donald Trump is not working to make this issue better. Every single opportunity he gets, he tries to exacerbate the problem. He leans into the racial divisions. He attacks the NFL every single opportunity he gets. And I think that he's doing essentially the opposite of what we need in this moment. Racial division is a national security issue. It's not something that is just, we want to feel warm and fuzzy and kumbaya moments. It's really about people dying, right? And Oakland, California recently, Nia Wilson was killed by allegedly a white supremacist. So rhetoric like this actually has real world consequences that could be potentially lethal for people of color. Additionally, we see that he's putting children into cages and separating them from their parents. And those children just so happen to also be of color. And so I think that the president right now is just making everything worse, which makes it more dangerous for people of color.
It also goes to the heart of, or much of what's wrong with the presidency, which is a character issue, just the absence of grace. What happened in Charlottesville was appalling. There is still an opportunity for the president to turn it around. There is still an opportunity for the president to turn to his speechwriters and say, you know what, write a speech for me.
But who's it going to be, Stephen Miller?
That's right.
Well, but no,
right? I mean, I think that
and to hire new speechwriters. He could be doing
make an attempt.
These things. He cannot, unfortunately, because it goes to the heart of the person he has been for the first 70 years of his life. And those of us, especially on the conservative side, who opposed him back in 2016 and continue to do so now, had a very clear principle. Someone who's been the man he is for 70 years, very hard to change that.
And the administration that he has built. It's not just about the words he says, it's about the things he does.
Construction, the apparatus
That's right.
around.
It's about hiring people like Jeff Sessions, even though Coretta Scott King came back from the grave to tell us that that was not the right choice. Right? So we know that over and over and over again, he is making policy decisions that right now, in this very moment, are putting people in harm's way. There are people and immigrants in this country who do not know what their future will hold. There are people who are being jailed for unjust reasons. Every single day, what he does, and not just what he says, is putting people in danger. And he has built a team to help him do all of those things. So we're never going to get that speech. We shouldn't hold our breath. We should be making sure that we're putting all of our energy and actually moving that administration aside and making the kind of progress that all of the American people need.
Talk more just about the ramifications of that. You're alluding to that a little bit, Zerlina, but Laura Ingraham, the Fox News host, said some extraordinary things at the top of her program on Wednesday at night, certainly reverberated throughout the week. Let's take a listen to what she had to say about the demographics of the United States and what people how they've interpreted what she said after that.
In some parts of the country, it does seem like the America that we know and love doesn't exist anymore. Massive demographic changes have been foisted upon the American people. And they're changes that none of us ever voted for, and most of us don't like. From Virginia to California, we see stark examples of how radically, in some ways, the country has changed. Now, much of this is related to both illegal and, in some cases, legal immigration that, of course, progressives love.
She doubled down on that the next night. Brett, I want to get you to react to that. We were talking about how, in the wake of Charlottesville, he talked about there being two sides to this, both sides. This country is split. It's been bifurcated. What do you hear when you hear Laura Ingraham saying what she said?
Well, I hear my own nauseation. I hear my refugee mother who came to this country with $7 and her mother, low-skilled, by the way. What I also hear is someone who doesn't represent what conservatives used to stand up for. You know, this is an underpopulated country, the United States. Any of you have flown from here to LA? Look out the window. There's not a lot out there. We could actually use a lot of immigrants, especially in flyover America. Go to counties in Kansas and Nebraska. Those places are emptying out. The death rate is higher than the birth rate. I want to talk about conservatives who should worry about about demographic changes. The real demographic change in society is getting older. So you need a pool of younger workers if we're going to maintain Social Security, Medicare. These are things that sort of people who were economically literate used to know. So what you're seeing with Laura Ingraham is the takeover of a kind of populist nativism over what used to be a common sense, I mean, I'm leaving aside the humanitarian issue, a free market understanding that immigrants built and continue to build this country. And by the way, immigrants from everywhere, whether they're Norwegian immigrants or Mexican immigrants, all of them are contributing in a hugely important way to different sectors of the economy. This should not be a liberal talking point, okay? This is also a conservative talking point, and it just shows how far the Republican Party has fallen under the kind of Trump, Ingraham, Sean Hannity regime, if you will.
Yeah, Zerlina, on that point, I mean, Brett's saying she doesn't speak for most conservatives. She has an audience. Many millions tune in to listen to her on the radio, to hear her fulminate on her TV show as well. Situate that base for me. Those who are listening to Laura Ingraham, where do they fall when you look at the pantheon of American politics today?
Well, they're Trump supporters, because anybody who post-Charlottesville is still a Trump supporter agrees with what Laura Ingraham said, because now we're sort of left with the people who actually do hold those racial resentment. And I think that what she's talking about in terms of demographics, she's talking about race, right? And so I agree with you that it's populist and it's nativism, but I would also just say it's racist, right? I think that we have to call it out and name it in this moment, because this is one of the most precarious moments in American history. We have literal Nazis in the street, not not hypothetical Nazis. The KKK is in the street. That means that we are mirroring points in American history that were lethal for many, many black people. And so I think that we have to name it racist.
Capital R. Yeah, Brett, quickly.
No, just very quickly. It's so true what you say, because I'll say, look, 100 years ago, at least on my father's side, my ancestors came over with no skills, no English, and so forth. And they'll say, when I get into these arguments, they'll say, well, not your ancestors. And you say, well, what's the difference? They came from a poor asshole country in Southeast Europe. And then the conversation goes silent. And what they're really saying is, well, your ancestors weren't Mexican. Actually, my father was born in Mexico. That's another story. Or, you know, they weren't African. Actually, Nigerian immigrants are some of the most successful immigrants that we have in America. But that's what you're getting at. And it's that racial animus that says those people don't look like us, therefore they cannot be real Americans.
Correct. But this is what always fascinates me. When people who identify as white in this country have any opinion about immigration whatsoever. Because I'm pretty sure that indigenous people in this country find them to be the immigrants, right? And are saying, who are you to set the rules for who's living in my country? So unless Laura Ingraham can tell me what tribe she's from or what African nation she was involuntarily brought here from, then she actually shouldn't have an opinion on this subject. The other thing we have to recognize is that historically, whiteness was invented in this country to capture European immigrants and give them a safety net. We know that when Irish people first came to this country, they were not accepted, but they could assimilate into whiteness. That power structure provided some people benefit and other people detriment. And so we know certain immigrants coming from certain places do not get that same protection. And this game that Laura Ingraham is playing is patently racist, but it is one in which she also invalidates the claims of racism. So notice she said what she said. It was a dog whistle. She used coded language, right? It's a very loud dog whistle, but it was coded language. And then she said, said, I wasn't talking about race. I was talking about safety, right? Another dog whistle. But because she then places herself to be the victim who is being misconstrued somehow, she invalidates all of the ways in which every single day people are dealing with racism, and she pretends as if she's tired of just talking about it.
We'll have more here on the cacophony of those dog whistles blowing loudly coming up here, and whether or not you plan to read that book. A quick programming note here: Omarosa is going to be on NBC's Meet the Press tomorrow with Chuck Todd to discuss that book and those explosive allegations. Up next, we're going to talk about Robert Mueller and the Manhattan Madam. What did Kristen Davis reveal during her testimony before the grand jury yesterday? We'll be right back. Well, we are back now with new developments in Robert Mueller's investigation. Investigators appear to be closing in on Trump confidant and former campaign aide Roger Stone by going after some of his closest allies and associates. Just yesterday, a judge ruled to hold Andrew Miller in contempt. He refused to testify before the special counsel's grand jury. This morning, it remains unclear what exactly the so-called Manhattan Madam testified about. She appeared before the grand jury yesterday. While the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, has been applying pressure on the special counsel to wrap up his investigation by September the 1st, we are now learning that another Stone associate, Randy Credico, expects to comply with a subpoena and will testify before the grand jury on September the 7th. Back with me, Brett Stevens, Brittany Packnett, Zerlina Maxwell, adding it to the table, Mike Pesca here, host of The Gist podcast from Slate. And joining the discussion from Washington, D.C. is Glenn Kirshner. He is a former federal prosecutor. We're going to start with the lawyer, I think, on this Saturday. I mentioned those names there. Let's start with Andrew Miller, if I could here, Glenn. What does that tell you, the fact that he has refused to testify about the seriousness of the allegations or what Roger Stone might face?
Well, good morning, David. So what it tells me is that, first of all, the investigative circle continues to constrict around Roger Stone. And if Mr. Miller's attorneys can be credited, they are saying that the reason that he's refusing to testify is because they're looking for a vehicle to kind of bubble up the issue to the appellate court. What issue is that? It's the issue of the legitimacy of the Mueller investigation. Now, I would say from my perspective, this seems to be pretty futile because multiple judges have already determined that the investigation is appropriate. The appointment of Mr. Mueller by Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein was lawful, was done in accordance with rules, procedures, and policies of the Department of Justice. So this seems to be a futile effort. Maybe it's just an attempt to delay. But I do think we're going to see that gentleman having to comply with that grand jury subpoena.
Yeah, if I could ask a question, Mueller has handed off parts of this investigation to others, and he's also kept parts for himself, like Manafort. So what do you read into the fact that he's riding herd specifically on the Roger Stone prosecution?
Oh, it tells me that Roger Stone is intimately related to the Russia investigation and any potential contact between the Trump campaign and the Russians. Bob Mueller is obviously taking his jurisdictional mandate very seriously because, as you say, he is passing things off when that's appropriate, but he is retaining investigative jurisdiction over those things that may relate to the issue of collusion/conspiracy. So I think, based on everything that we've seen concerning Roger Stone, it makes perfect sense that Mueller is retaining jurisdiction over that piece of the investigation.
A lot happening at once, of course. All the while, you've got President Trump's personal attorneys going back and forth with Special Counsel Robert Mueller and his team about the prospects for an interview with the President of the United States. Rudy Giuliani has described the President as champing at the bit here to sit down with Bob Mueller to answer his questions. That runs in contrast to what we have heard from his counsel. Let's take a listen.
Are you going to talk to Mueller?
I'm looking forward to it, actually.
You want to? Do you have a date set?
Here's the story, just so you understand. There's been no collusion whatsoever. Yeah. There's no obstruction whatsoever. And I'm looking forward to it.
We're going to be the laughingstock of lawyers if we let him testify.
So I would say this. If I could be, I would love to speak. I would love to. Nobody wants to speak more than me.
Because of them, we don't want him to testify because they're not fair.
I've always wanted to do an interview because, look, there's been no collusion. There's been no talk of Russia.
You couldn't put a lawyer on this show who wants to keep his law license to tell you he should testify.
But if you're his attorney, why don't you say, go in, talk to Robert Mueller, tell the truth?
Because I wouldn't be an attorney if I did that, George. I'd be living in some kind of unreal fantasy world.
Would you be willing to speak under oath to give your version of those events?
100%.
100%. Zerlina, I'm going to turn to you as we look into this fantasy world here. These two lawyers have been extremely busy this week, filling in on radio shows, being guests of one another on one of their radio shows. Presumably, they spend some time talking to the president of the United States. What is the, not just apparent, but evident disconnect here between these lawyers and their client? Tell you about the way all this is proceeding.
It reminds me of like when you're in high school and you're like, we're gonna fight. I'm gonna beat that person up, and you talk trash like before the fight actually takes place outside. That's what's going on here. The president is sort of like beating his chest and sticking it out and saying, I'm ready for Bob Mueller. I'm gonna take on that fight, but he's not going to testify. I think this is essentially spin on the part of Jay Sekulow and Rudy Giuliani to essentially set it up to pull out of whatever interview may arise through a subpoena or a request to the president. So I think that this is spin for the media, for us to discuss. But going back to Roger Stone for a moment, he's at the center of the collusion story. We often skip over him. We talk about other people like Manafort and Rick Gates, understandably so. But Russia had multiple entry points into the Trump campaign, and one of them was Roger Stone. He's the only person among this group of other associates now the ones that have pled guilty or who are facing indictments. He's the only one that we've seen his messages with Guccifer 2.0. We know that he was communicating with the carve-out of Russian intelligence that was leaking the emails through the campaign. And so I think that we're going to see even more evidence come out. And when, the special counsel is interviewing everybody who knows you, that's a bad sign.
Not a good one. Brittany, I want to stick with the schoolyard analogy here. Here we are in 2018. I suppose Twitter is the mechanism by which you can make those threats. And we saw that in very fine focus this week. You had the president insulting LeBron James on Twitter, insulting Don Lemon as well. Just a few hours later, hopping on the plane, going to Ohio, and his tune changes entirely.
The bully always operates like that, right? They do a whole lot of talking, and they're not ready to walk that talk, especially because they like to come up against people who they really don't want to fight. You don't actually want to fight with Maxine Waters or LeBron James. Trust me, right? And yet, here we are, because all you have is your mouth, right? All you have is the chance to run your mouth because the substance isn't there. We know that because of the probable cause that has led to this number of indictments. We know that because the other shoe keeps dropping, and then the other shoe keeps dropping, and then the other shoe keeps dropping. So clearly there's a there, and in order to try to distract us, you want to keep having that conversation. But here's what people are, like real people are saying at barbershops and at beauty shops and around their kitchen tables. They're like, I'm not going to read all the details of this stuff. Just tell me when it's over. Tell me when we can impeach him, and tell me which social media platforms not to trust with
Is there a danger to that? Is that level of disengagement dangerous, do you think, as all of this plays out? I mean, that may or may not happen. I think the odds are it probably will not happen, at least in the next couple of years.
I think it can be dangerous, but I think we have to understand what it's rooted in. We already talked in the last segment about all of the ills and the dangers that people are dealing with under this administration. And let's be very clear, those ills are not new because of this administration. They are, however, exacerbated because of this administration. So people are saying, is my factory job going to be there in 6 months? Can I feed my children? Will this public housing complex actually support me in the way that I need? Those are real questions that people are dealing with. So they really don't have time to deal with the minutia of this. What they're saying is, I know that I've been lied to, and I want to make sure that I'm not lied to again.
And Brittany is putting her finger on something that's so important, so central to the president's strategy, which is essentially to create like a fog machine on stage. I mean, it's incredibly difficult, even for those of us who are in the news business, to follow day by day, hour by hour, every single twist in the Mueller investigation. What's appropriate, what's not, what's a FISA court, how were warrants obtained? And all of this is meant to just essentially create a kind of black hole in people's minds. So they say, I don't really care. This is just Washington talking. What I care about is no collusion. By the way, a term we should never use. We should always use the term conspiracy, which is the legal, and there is conspiracy, which is the legal term of art. But that's essentially what they prey on. And it goes back to Nixon. Look, Nixon's fate would probably have been different if there hadn't been an oil crisis in 1973. If the economy had been strong and growing in his second term, it would have been a very different story. I think that's what Trump Trump is banking on now. If the economy continues to do relatively well, people are just going to tune out and say, this is Washington and television talking. I don't want to hear about it.
Mike, quickly, I know you have your fog lights on.
That is his strategy to make people, and I don't go to too many barbershops, but that is his strategy to make people say, tell me when it's over. It doesn't mean it's a good strategy. Yeah, in the polls, I want this investigation to end is ticking up, but it doesn't matter for Mueller. And what matters is the actual indictments and the actual facts. I guess it's the only cards they have to play to create this miasma of chatter about will he or won't he, and to make people tuned out to it. But I don't think it's going to work.
8 months in, it continues, that back and forth between the president's lawyers and the special counsel. Glenn Kirshner, thanks very much. We're going to come back to you down in Washington a little later in the show. Brett, Brittany, Mike, Zerlina, stick around with me, because up next, the president just out with a tweet on Charlottesville. We're going to have details on that after the break. What the president might do. Brett, you mentioned the president still has an opportunity here to address what happened in Charlottesville. I'll go to you first. How close to doing that is this one tweet from the president on this Saturday morning?
It's not close at all, especially when the rest of your timeline is talking about a North Korean dictator's height and insulting a basketball player, right? I mean, we cannot actually take what's on that timeline very seriously, especially if you are only committing 280 characters to something that should not only take more words, but should take more action. So my response to that tweet is prove it. Prove to me that you are a president for all Americans. Prove to me that you stand against racism in all of its forms. Prove that to me by letting somebody like Jeff Sessions go. Prove that to me by ending family separation and actually reuniting all of these families. Prove that to me by making sure that Heather Heyer and Nia Wilson and Michael Brown no longer are names that we have to hashtag. Prove it to me, and then I won't have anything to say about your tweets. The problem is we're never going to see that proof.
Brett, she's proposing there what seems like a whole-scale reinvention.
Well, look, it's not going to happen for the reasons we mentioned earlier in the show. This is a character whose views have been formed and have been actually pretty consistent for many years.
But you said he still had the opportunity to do this.
Yeah, there is an opportunity. I'm not ruling it out completely. I'm saying it's extremely.
You're being an eternal optimist.
Well, no. Look, you have to say he is the president of the United States. There is a chance, and we ought to urge him to do it, not to have a tweet, but to deliver a speech, to rethink the attitudes of his Justice Department, to rethink his choice of an Attorney General, to systematically go through what his administration is doing and change that. I think the odds of that happening are somewhat as likely as the Space Force
getting... got it in there. I knew you were going to get it in there.
As getting space to pay for the Space Force. Or Mexico to pay for the wall, for that matter. But it's important to urge him to do this. And, I suspect that tweet may have come from just listening to this show as he watches, perambulates through television all of the time. Unfortunately, as someone mentioned, this is a history that goes back more than 40 years to discrimination in New York housing, to the case of the Central Park 5, to the birtherism in 2011, to the slurs against Judge Gonzalo Curiel in 2016, to the outreach, the playing footsie with the David Dukes of the world, the alt-right and Pepe the Frog employments in 2016, to his slurs against the Gold Star family that same year, on and on and on, of course, culminating in Charlottesville. So, yes, it's going to be difficult, but I'm saying he still should do it.
Might get in here. He's listed a long catalog of offenses there.
It goes beyond that. Yeah. You know that for Donald Trump, racism is not a character flaw. It's an electoral strategy.
Right.
He needs it. He is not the president without racism. Alan Abramowitz wrote a book where they looked at the racial animus of the voters, and Trump did so much better than any other candidate, to the extent that people who expressed racial animus were much more likely to vote for Barack Obama than they were to vote against Donald Trump. He needs the racial animus, and the point is that it's working. It's working for him. In fact, it's all he has, because he's not delivering any material improvement to the lives of the people who voted for him. And the proof that it's working is not just everything that you said. It's that we always say things like, what if Donald Trump, for all the mishigas of his administration so far,
one way to put it,
what if he had his Katrina? What if he had his war in Iraq? The fact is, he already has.
That's right.
It was the hurricane in Puerto Rico, and 1,400 people die, and we don't even talk about that. And what the non-college educated white voter who voted for Donald Trump once, since he's not getting the jobs back and since he's not getting anything materially, he at least wants not to be reminded of racism. And it worked because no one talks about what should be a massive conversation about how America turned its back on Puerto Rico. Since no one talks about that, since Donald Trump effectively has taken it off the table with all the other stuff he's done, he at least is comforting the racist in America, and that's what he needs to do to get reelected.
All right.
The other piece here is that, and again, this is about the team that he has built, right? Because when I look at somebody like Betsy DeVos, who has essentially leveled the Civil Rights Department in the Department of Education, we know what your intentions are beyond what your tweet is. So I don't really care what you say. I care much more what you do. And you've proven time and time and time again exactly what you plan on doing and what your team is going to do.
All right, we're going to come back here in just a moment. Tomorrow, on that one-year mark of that deadly clash between protesters and white nationalists in Charlottesville, Virginia, MSNBC is going to share the story of a former white supremacist who has dedicated his life to reforming others. You can watch Breaking Hate tomorrow at 9 p.m. Eastern on MSNBC. And coming up, growing division over whether Nancy Pelosi should take over the speakership if Democrats were to win back control of the House. That's next. Plus, Donald Trump under oath, what his deposition could tell his lawyers about whether or not he should testify before the special counsel. Welcome back. I'm David Gura. The magic number for the Democrats this midterm is 23. That is the number of seats they need to flip to reclaim the House of Representatives. But after Tuesday's nail-biter in Ohio's 12th congressional district, both Democrats and Republicans are seeing new signs of a potential blue wave, as NBC News reports that more than 50 Democratic candidates now say they would oppose Nancy Pelosi as House Speaker. I want to bring my panel back in, and also joining us from Washington is Stephen Shepard. He is Politico's campaigns and elections editor. I want to start with something I read in the National Review. They were commenting on the fact here that President Trump is taking credit for what happened on Tuesday night, that his presence there before that election made it a success for Republicans. The National Review saying he's whistling past the graveyard. What's your sense of what that electoral result on Tuesday says about the midterms?
Well, I think certainly you can look at a difference of 1,600 votes and point to any small factor. And the president certainly eager to take credit for this victory. The fact remains, though, this is a district he won by 11 percentage points in 2016. It's a district that's been represented by Republicans for 35 years, including John Kasich and the most recent Congressman Pat Tiberi. And so even a 1-point victory, if that's how it ends up, it's currently too close to call, is the final result. I'm not sure how you could spin that as a good result for Republicans when it comes to all 435 seats up for election in November.
Steve, what's your sense of the role that President Trump is going to play? There was a piece in Axios this week about how the president and his team is working with the Republican National Committee, with other Republican groups, to sort of scheme about where the president might go, where his daughter and senior advisor might go in place of him. How does this change the campaigning strategy for this president, for Republicans more generally?
Well, I think there's a number of districts that are up for grabs this cycle. Some of them are suburban districts that have traditionally been represented by Republicans, but where Donald Trump struggled compared to previous Republican candidates in 2016. The voters there are more educated. That may be places where he wants to stay out. There are also, though, there are 10 Senate Democrats running for re-election in states that Donald Trump won in 2016, including 5 that he carried by double digits. Places like West Virginia, Montana, Indiana, Missouri, North Dakota. Those are places where he could potentially be useful on the trail. And I think if he and the White House are smart, that's where you'll see him more than campaigning in some of these districts where, congressional districts where he's not as popular.
All right, Stephen Shepard, thank you very much for joining us from Politico. I'm going to go around the table here. I was mentioning just a moment ago there's some controversy about if Democrats were to get control of the House again, if Nancy Pelosi would be House Speaker once again. Of course, the Democratic candidate in the 12th congressional district in Ohio said he would not support Nancy Pelosi. So we'll do one-word answers. Zerlina, I'll start with you. Do you think that if Democrats get the House back, she'll be the House Speaker? Oh, my gosh.
One word.
One word.
One word. I mean, I can't say yes or no. Yes.
Yes. Brett.
Shouldn't.
Should. Oh, it's contracted.
That's good.
Go ahead, Brett.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
Shan't.
Shan't. The gentleman using contractions and cheating in that game. Up next, President Trump will he sit face-to-face with Special Counsel Robert Mueller? We're going to have some new information that may help us with the answer to that question.
With his tendency to cheat on facts, it's no wonder Trump's lawyers don't want the president to sit down for an interview with Special Counsel Robert Mueller. And the folks on Fox News agree.
How in the world could he ever cooperate and sit down with Mueller for an interview, knowing that if you tell one lie to Bob Mueller, he will move to file charges?
Well, this sounds crazy, but hear me out. He could not lie.
Well, the back and forth continues between President Trump's legal team and special counsel Robert Mueller. Will the president sit down for an interview or not? This week, the president's lawyers rejected Robert Mueller's interview terms, saying they consider questions about obstruction of justice to be legally inappropriate. Instead, they made a counteroffer to maybe the last best chance Robert Mueller has to secure the president's testimony. I want to bring back Glenn Kirshner, former federal prosecutor. The panel's with me as well. And Glenn, if you'll indulge me, the president did testify back in 2016. There was a deposition involving Jeffrey Zakarian, who is a chef who had a deal to put a restaurant in President Trump's hotel in Washington, D.C. He pulled out of that plan. And President Trump did have to sit down to answer some questions from lawyers. Let's take a listen to how that went.
I obviously have credibility because I now, as it turns out, became the Republican nominee. People have said there's never been anything like this. O'Reilly said the other night, I did something to the effect that this is one of the great phenomena that he's ever seen in his lifetime.
You're personally involved in everything that your name represents. What does that mean?
And I'm very much involved in the details. I was involved in the design of the building and the room sizes and the entrances. I believe my son Don worked on it for the most part, but I haven't been involved in it almost at all. And the lobby and the marble and the bathrooms and the fixtures. I wasn't too much involved in it. It was mostly my son and daughter. The bars and a lot of things.
Did you have any understanding about the key business points in the lease negotiations?
No, I didn't.
Did they tell you how they were going? Was there any issue?
No, never did. Just, we have a deal.
Just, we have a deal?
We have a deal. They said, we just signed the lease, we have a deal with Zakarian. I'm involved very much with the hotel.
Glenn, good to have you with us here. You got the president in one image there with the tape measure on his tool belt, on his hands and knees, measuring the size of that king-size room there at the Trump International Hotel. And then he says, no, I wasn't involved in such minute detail. Rudy Giuliani talks about the prospects for there being a perjury trap. I must say, Glenn, watching that, I can understand some of the trepidation that the president's counsel might have.
David, first of all, Mueller and his team will be studying that deposition and any other deposition and recorded statement that the president has made. But can I just unpack the loaded term perjury trap for a moment? So we hear, it's one of Mr. Giuliani's favorite refrains that the president won't sit down with Mr. Mueller because Mr. Mueller has set a perjury trap. Let me use an example. Let's assume that Mr. Mueller is trying to determine whether I had a cup of coffee on set today. So he interviews the cameraman, he interviews the gentleman who mic'd me up, he interviews the makeup artist who did her best to make me camera ready this morning. And he has a pretty good picture of the evidence supporting the notion that I had a cup of coffee this morning. He then invites me in for an interview, and I sit down and I say, I did not have a cup of coffee this morning. Mr. Giuliani would call that a perjury trap. Let's work with that loaded term. If it's a perjury trap, it doesn't take Houdini to escape from it. All you need to do is tell the truth. I would suggest every time Mr. Giuliani says that Mr. Mueller is setting a perjury trap for the president, the American people should hear that as the president is either unwilling or incapable of coming in and telling the truth.
Going to get a forensic expert in here to test what's in my cup, Mike Pesca. I just want to get you to react to this back and forth. I mean, this is something that has been promulgated by the president's lawyers mostly. We have heard precious little from the special counsel and his team about this whole process.
Oh, nothing.
What does that say to you about the importance of this interview? It is Rudy Giuliani and Jay Sekulow. They are the ones saying that this is paramount. This is incredibly important, that it needs to happen here, that they're pressuring the White House, pressuring President Trump to sit down for this interview.
Right. It's that Mueller doesn't leak and the president's team scrambles. They have a problem, several problems, and it's that it's not that President Trump lies or habitually lies. There have been academic texts written on the difference between lying and BS. And what BS is, and I'm calling it BS, although a really good little treatise uses the full name, is that he doesn't know the difference between truth and lies. So there's basically no chance he's not going to say, there's no chance he will do a deposition without saying loads of things that are untruthful. And the irony is, the way for him to explain away the public statements that he made that would seem to indicate obstruction of justice, like I fired Comey because of the investigation, is to say, well, I was lying then, is to say I was BSing then. So the only way to get himself out of some of this is to indicate in the past that he was BSing. But of course, since he can only BS, that puts you in what I guess they would say a perjury trap or a position to perjure.
Brittany, I want to step back. I look at the tweet that the president sent about Charlottesville, what we've talked about, the president having an opportunity perhaps to talk about unifying this country. Let's talk about his aversion to apologizing or recognizing what's wrong or what he might have done wrong in the past. That, to me, is still one of the hugest hurdles this president faces.
Yeah.
A willingness to be introspective, first of all. Second of all, to recognize when he's made a mistake and to say so.
But we are, when we expect that, we're asking him to be the exact opposite of the person he's been his entire life and career. He is someone who has relied on the fact that the rules do not apply to him. So, you know, when his companies are not going in the direction that he wants, he just files bankruptcy, avoids his bills, and moves on to the next project. When he wanted to be president, he didn't apologize for the ways in which he's admittedly sexually harassed women. He just moved right on forward, called it locker room talk, told all of us that we were crazy for even thinking that there was something wrong, and moved right into the Oval Office. So he relies on the fact that the rules don't apply to him. And I just want to say, in terms of asking him to be someone that he is not, it's clear from his continued Twitter conversation that he's probably watching this show. So let me be really clear with you. He talked about African American and Latinx unemployment numbers. He talked about the supposed support that he has for criminal justice reform. Let's pretend like all of those things are true. Let's pretend like all of those things were not started by the last administration. And even if those things are true, Mr. Trump, as you are tweeting at us and as you are watching this show, recognize that there is far more harm that you are doing to all of the American people than there is room for in a tweet. So actually use the rest of your administration to prove us wrong.
You know, you
go very quickly.
Trump's strategy is you can't shame the shameless, but you can hoist him on his own petard. Mueller should make a deal with the president. If you testify, we'll wrap up the investigation.
All right, thanks to all of you. I really appreciate it. Brittany, having your Alan Dershowitz Fox News moment there. We'll be right back here after this break.
At Farmers, we've seen